Hey, HOA. Today we're going to take a look at continuing Reconstruction after the 1868 election and going through 1877, a little bit of what happens after that. And remember, our guiding question for this unit is still going to be, was Reconstruction successful? So the 1868 election was kind of interesting. When you look at the electoral votes, it's a landslide for President Grant. But on the popular vote side, it was much, much closer. The difference in the popular vote was only 309,000 votes out of over 5.5 million cast. And considering that included in that is 700,000 votes from African Americans, either freedmen or people who were not slaves before the war. That's a big deal. I mean, it's really clear to everybody after the election of 1868 that the Republican Party, if they want to win national elections, they're going to have to get black votes, and those black votes are primarily going to be concentrated in the southern states. So you see here, when Grant wins Missouri, Arkansas, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, those are states that he's winning primarily because of the fact that the freedmen are voting and many former Confederates are not. The green on there, Texas, Missouri, or Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia at this point, still not fully back into the Union, still haven't met all the requirements put on them by Congress. So Grant, at the time that he's elected, he's the youngest president to date at 46. There's been a few younger since then, but not many. And Grant had relatively limited political experience. I mean, he had to handle a lot of political stuff during the war. He had to deal with, Lincoln, and he had to deal with Congress, and he certainly had an understanding of, populations that had to be managed in the South in areas that had been occupied by the Army. But he's not a career politician, and he's not somebody who was firmly part of the Republican Party apparatus. So in a sense, he's going to be a little bit of an outsider. And that's going to make it maybe a little easier for him to bridge the gap between the radicals and the moderates in the Republican Party. Grant is going to have something that Andrew Johnson did not have, which is widespread support in the country. And Grant's slogan in the campaign of 1868 is going to be, "Let us have peace." And the general way that that's interpreted is, let's get the country back to something like normal, but a normal that's going to be a stable normal, and that is still going to have room for making the kind of changes in the South that need to be made. So Grant is definitely going to be supportive of parts of the radical Republican agenda, but he's not going to be a full-throated radical Republican himself. Now, one of the first orders of business once the election is over, and actually before Grant even takes office, is Congress is going to pass the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment is going to guarantee the right to vote regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. And this primarily means, freedmen. Now, this is the first time in history that the federal government really kind of stepped in and tried to impose some rules about elections. Prior to this time, and in the original Constitution, elections were run by the states, managed by the states. The states decided who voted and who didn't. And so this is the federal government kind of attempting to exert some power over that question. At this point, there's already, like I said, there were 700,000 freedmen who voted in the 1868 election. but that was by virtue of the Reconstruction Act. And what Congress is concerned about is that at some point in the future, those states, if they come back under the control of the Southern elites, could wipe away through simple legislation everything that had been accomplished. So the 15th Amendment is an attempt to write this into the Constitution and make it stick in the long run. Now, there was a lot of debate when they were talking about the 15th Amendment of whether it should apply to women. And this is really kind of the beginning of the women's suffrage movement, is when women get left out. The moderate Republicans say, women voting, ooh, no, too much, too much. And so the 15th Amendment as written only applied to males. And it was sufficient to get it ratified. But women are going to have to wait about another half century before they are going to get their voting rights. Now, so in this, newly congressionally reconstructed South, we got a lot of different factions, and they have some interests in common and some interests not in common. But we need some terminology to talk about these people. So obviously the freedmen are former slaves who have been freed either through their own efforts or from the 13th Amendment or whatever. They are mostly not very well educated, but once they are no longer slaves, a lot of them are, feverishly working on that problem because they know that that is a problem. So they're, a lot of them are going to school at night while they're trying to work jobs and deal with their families and all that kind of thing. Very interested in, maintaining their rights, their newly acquired civil rights. You've also got free people of color. Now, most of these are going to be folks who are coming down from the north. And these might be people who escaped slavery prior to the Civil War, or the children of people who escaped slavery prior to the Civil War, or something like that. You're also going to have some free people of color coming from outside the United States who are saying, this is an interesting time to maybe there's some opportunities in the United States. So that's going to be a kind of a mixed bag of people, but they are, generally speaking, going to be better educated than the freedmen. And in some cases, they're going to have more resources available. Some of these are going to be business people who have managed to acquire some wealth and are able to use it. Now, on the white side of the ledger, you've got basically three groups. And two of them we use, historians tend to use terminology, which is kind of unfortunate because it's pejorative terms that were labeled onto these people by Southerners who did not want to see social change. But these terms kind of stuck in that period, and so we're kind of stuck with them, but I put scare quotes around them just so you know. Scalawags, which again is not a compliment, was the term used to refer to white Southerners who joined the Republican Party. And these people kind of fall into maybe two groups. Some of them were sort of diehard unionists who had been unionists, all through the Civil War and had been, in that oppressed minority during the time of Confederate rule, and now they're kind of coming out of the shadows and, doing their thing. Some of them are going to be people who have sort of, seen which way the wind is blowing and want to get on board with the new system. And to be quite honest, some of them are probably opportunists who are just, finger in the wind and, it seems like these guys are the place to be. Or they're people who just didn't care very much about politics and, they're doing it that way. Then you have another pejorative term, carpetbaggers, who were referred to. The image was these are people who packed up all their stuff in a suitcase, a carpet bag, basically a suitcase made out of carpet. and move to the south. Now, a lot of these people are going to be involved in railroads. Railroad people who are interested in building railroads and developing railroads made their way to the south because there's a tremendous amount of potential there for building railroads. And you do it the right way, you can make a lot of money. So there's a lot of that going on. There's other people who are investors. They've got some money, and you can buy things in the South pretty cheap because everybody's broke. So at least in the mind of white Southerners who are not Republicans, these are seen as foreign opportunists who are taking advantage of their problems. And there certainly is some of that, but there's also a lot of these people are just legitimate, looking for opportunities, trying to do the best to develop the country for the good of everyone. So don't get too hung up on the pejoratives. And then there are the conservatives, and these are the people who are mostly either the pre-war elite, the former slave-owning class, or people who are supportive of that agenda. They are, aligned with the National Democratic Party, but they're not necessarily going to call themselves Democrats. They prefer to call themselves conservatives so that they can reach out to maybe people who were more comfortable with the Whig Party before the war, and set themselves up in opposition to the radicals that they see as being in charge in the North. So these congressionally reconstructed governments are going to be run by the Republican factions, by a combination of freedmen, other African Americans, scalawags, and carpetbaggers. And they are going to rewrite the state constitution, elect Republican governments, and amongst those elected officials, there are going to be some African Americans, but not a lot. There's a tendency to think that, this was like, this huge wave of African Americans, and it's really relatively small numbers. And part of the reason that it's relatively small numbers is white people are still in the majority in every southern state except South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And even in those states, while there is a majority of African Americans, it's a very small majority. It's like 53, 54%. So there really isn't any place where the freedmen are just going to be able to say this is the way it is, and we're doing our thing. Freedmen, if they're going to have any kind of political influence at all, have to be working in coalition with some number of white people, and that's going to limit kind of every sort of political, economic, social change that these governments try to do is going to be something that has to be negotiated between these three groups. And their interests are not going to be the same on all of those issues. But let's take a look at some of those issues. Probably the biggest one is education. Prior to the war, public education, in the sense that we think of it, where the government runs a school system that is free to all, and anybody can go and learn how to read and write and do basic math and that kind of thing. That just didn't exist in the South for anybody. If you got an education in the South prior to the Civil War, you were either a wealthy person who maybe had if you were really wealthy, you had a tutor who came to your plantation and did your education there, or you would be packed off at a fairly young age to some kind of boarding school, probably in the North, where you would get your education that way. But for the children of yeoman farmers, they were probably just taught by their parents, and they would, learn the basics, but not have anything like a whole lot of formal education. And if you were, sort of lower on the social scale than yeoman farmers if you were non-landowning whites or obviously slaves. You didn't get educated at all. In fact, in the case of slaves, it was illegal to teach a slave how to read and write. That didn't mean that a lot of slaves didn't learn how to read and write, but it was something that was not done in the open. So creating public schools to educate all of these people who hadn't previously been getting a formal education is a very high priority. But the schools that they're creating were segregated schools. They were not, mixing white and black children together. They were keeping them separate. Now, part of that was, something that was going to make this more appealing to the scallywags, if you will, or even the carpetbaggers. I mean, in the North, the tradition had been, generally speaking, black children and white children did not go to school together. And if you were in an area that had, maybe 2 or 3 black children, they might end up going to regular school because, it didn't make any sense to have a separate school. But generally speaking, that wasn't a thing. The social divide between these two groups was something that was considered very important. And that's not a battle that the freedmen are really looking to fight in, the 1860s, 1870s. They want to get the schools operating as soon as possible. Railroads are also going to be a huge deal. You remember when we were talking about causes of the Civil War, the South didn't have a whole lot of railroad mileage prior to 1861. And a lot of what they had been destroyed during the war in one way or another. Either the tracks torn up or the actual equipment, the trains destroyed, damaged, that kind of thing. So there's a huge opportunity here for investment in constructing railroads. And most of these Reconstruction governments were putting a fairly high priority on this because it seemed as a way to kind of jumpstart the economy. And this is something that all of the different factions could agree on. But exactly how to do this and what the priority of this should be is a little bit different. For carpetbaggers, I would argue this is a much bigger issue than education because carpetbaggers already have education. For scalawags and freedmen, education might be a little more important, and railroads would take a second place. But remember, for anything to get done, you need sort of everybody on the same page. And that page is going to involve taxes. All of this stuff, the schools and the railroad construction, are going to cost money. Now, prior to the war, taxes in the South had been extraordinarily low. The Southern elite, which had the land and controlled most of the economy, did not like the idea of paying taxes. And so they didn't. And that's, governments were kept very small and had very, very limited responsibilities, which did not include taking care of people who needed things. Reconstruction government's going to have to change that, and they're primarily looking at property taxes to do that. Now, the way they saw property taxes is it was kind of a twofer. If the Southern elites were able to pay the taxes, if they had the money to do that, then there you go. Money's coming in, and we can use that for the things we need to do. But if they didn't have the actual cash to pay the taxes, what that would do was create an incentive for unused land, unproductive land that was owned by the Southern elites, but not really being used for anything, that land would be sold or seized for non-payment of taxes and could then be redistributed to people who needed it. So this is kind of seen as a way for the state government to kind of undo what Andrew Johnson had done in giving all this land back to the pre-war owners. Now that obviously is going to create a lot of resentment amongst the Southern elite. They're going to, and this image kind of shows that. What you see here is the carpetbagger uh, riding on the back of the poor Solid South, who has to carry the burden of these taxes, which were seen as supporting the profits of the carpetbagger, a foreigner who had come to our land and was, cranking up our taxes to build his damn railroads so that he could make obscene profits. And it's all made possible by the army, the soldiers with their bayonets. In fact, bayonet rule was a term that was used for this. The message that the Southern elite is sending out to all white landowners is you are being treated like a conquered province. There is no democracy, and it's not a good thing. So, a very one-sided view of this, but take it for what it's worth. Uh, the other big issue is debt. Um, Now, the 14th Amendment, one of the provisions in the 14th Amendment, specifically said any debt taken on by Confederate states during the war is not going to be paid. If you lent money to the Confederate States of America or to the Confederate State of Virginia or to the Confederate State of Alabama or anybody else, you're not getting your money back. Deal with it. But that didn't answer the question of what about debt from before the war. Uh, a lot of southern states had borrowed money prior to the Civil War, and they had been, making payments on the debt prior to the war. Some of them continued making payments during the war. Some of them didn't. A lot of, depending on, who the debt was owed to, maybe you got paid in Confederate money, which ended up being worthless, or whatever. But now that the war is over, that debt, that pre-war debt, is still there. Now, what a lot of, particularly the freedmen and the scallywags, what they want to do is delay payment of this debt. Because, why we got such a problem with collecting taxes, and we have so many needs to, rebuild this area. It's stupid to take a huge chunk of the, insufficient funds that we have and just shove it off to a bunch of banks or rich people because of debts that were run up prior to the Civil War by people who weren't even us. And so they wanted to delay repayments, stretch out the payment terms, that kind of thing. This was not popular at all with the Southern conservatives and with the carpetbaggers, because the carpetbaggers, a lot of them were involved with railroad companies and banks in the North who were holding a lot of this debt at this point, and they want their money. And the idea that you can borrow money and then, be kind of willy-nilly about how you pay it back is something that was just, not anything that should be considered if you're a moderate Republican, former Whig kind of type, that sort of thing. Debt was sacred. It had to be paid in full with all the interest before anything else happens. So this is another fault line that's going to run between the wealthier interests in the South and the not so wealthy interests in the South. And there's also going to be a question of corruption. As you have government spending more money, and this is the case of the reconstructed state governments, but also the national government, the more politicians spend money, the more that some of that money, what do we say here, ends up in somebody's pocket where it isn't necessarily it's supposed to be. For example, railroad promoters. You could, where exactly that railroad gets built has a huge influence on land values. And so promoters who might buy up land in a particular area, and then when they can get it cheap because the railroad isn't there yet, and then they, propose the railroad, and they spread a little bit of money around the state house to get the votes to put the railroad where they want it, and then they're going to make that money back, 10 times over once the railroad is approved and the land values go up, that kind of thing. Or you have, government contracts to build schools, and the guy who gets the contract to build the schools raises his price just a little bit, charges a little extra for the school, and that little extra ends up in his pocket, that kind of thing. The cartoon here, the central figure in the top hat is President Grant, and I don't know if you can see the captions there, but he's saying his campaign slogan, "Let us have peace," P-E-A-C-E. But what he's got is the government cake that is going to be the money that is going to be spread hither and yon. And all of these politicians and operators, they are all saying, "Let us have a piece," P-I-E-C-E, meaning a piece of the cake. A little bit of a pun. But there you go. Now, corruption in the Reconstruction period is going to get a lot of attention. And it's going to be one of the things that Reconstruction governments are criticized for. But really, I don't know that it was necessarily all that much worse in the South than it was anywhere else. But it's certainly, that's going to be the message that Southern conservatives spread when they are trying to attack the whole concept of Reconstruction. So you've got this little guy alliance that is trying to form itself between the freedmen and the poor whites. They have a common interest in certain things. And they actually, for a time, there was this thing called the Readjuster movement, which was a separate political party, separate from the Republicans, but working with the Republicans, which wanted to readjust the debt, meaning, delay payments, interest, that kind of thing. And that was a movement that kind of brought together freedmen and white people who didn't have the same kind of financial interests that the wealthy did. The problem with this is kind of the yeoman farmers. The yeoman farmers were really, they were going to be junior members of this coalition. They would get some benefits, but not as much benefit from the schools and infrastructure and that kind of thing. And the yeoman farmers, unlike the other two, are going to be paying those taxes because they own land. And so, the freedmen and the poor whites all by themselves were not really going to be enough to get you a majority coalition. And it was going to be really hard to get a few more votes into this alliance. And that's why I put the question mark on there. This is an alliance that isn't really going to happen. It was something that the radical Republicans really, really, really wanted to see. But at the end of the day, the numbers just weren't there. What was going to be more successful was the big guy alliance. The Southern white elite and the Northern financial interests, banks and railroads, found that they had a lot of common interests. And that common interest was maintain the debt payments, build the railroads, but education should be a much lower priority. And if you figure out that maybe you can have public education for white people, but not for black people, you see where a coalition can be formed here that is a majority coalition going forward. And that's kind of the way this is going to end up. Eventually, the radical Republicans nationally are going to start to lose power. The corruption that was going on nationally, not just in the South, created a lot of disillusionment. I mean, these people are idealists. They want a better system. And what they see is not, a nice democratic system where, people have votes and civil rights and all that kind of thing. What they see is a bunch of political operators working the system to get rich and doing it only because they have, military occupation of the South. This really isn't looking like the kind of democracy that they had wanted to build. And frankly, a lot of these radicals are just starting to lose interest in the whole project. It's clear that it's not going the way that they had hoped, and it's taking a lot longer. And other issues are coming up and being more important. And for moderate Republicans, it's the same thing. Moderate Republicans are kind of answering to banks and the railroads and other economic issues, and civil rights is just not something that they're willing. It's not a hill they want to die on anymore. They got other things that they're concerned about. The country as a whole, at least white America, is sort of moving on from the war. And in moving on from the war, they are leaving the freedmen behind. Part of that is going to be the Amnesty Act of 1872. With the support of the freedmen, this is important, the freedmen were not in favor of permanently restricting the voting rights of former Confederates. The freedmen believed that voting should be universal for everybody, guaranteed. And they understood that, we might today tell the former Confederates they can't vote, but someday it's going to be them telling us that we can't vote, and better that everybody should vote. But the more that everybody votes, the harder it's going to be to cobble together that little guy alliance and have it be a ruling coalition. The other thing that's going to have an impact is something that's in some ways unrelated completely to Reconstruction, and that's the financial panic of 1873, which is a global depression, which happens in 1873. It has to do with a lot of stuff, and it's very complicated in terms of the economic factors. But to kind of briefly summarize, it has a lot to do with overexpansion of railroads and industry and excessive debt globally. A lot of debt had been run up in the middle of the 19th century. In the United States, you had the debt that the Union ran up in fighting the war. You've got businesses who are going into debt and all of that kind of thing. And when there's a lot of debt in the economy, sooner or later, there has to be an adjustment, what we would call a correction, to kind of sort that all out. And because this is at a time when there weren't a lot of government safety nets for people, when the economy corrected itself, it was pretty painful. A lot of businesses are going to go bankrupt, stock market's going to crash, banks are going to fail, which of course, when the bank fails, all of your savings that are in the bank go in a puff of smoke. Wages are going to fall, there's going to be unemployment and labor unrest. This is when you get strikes and all of that kind of stuff. All of this is extremely unpleasant. And because the Republicans are running the show, whoever's the incumbent gets blamed for the economy. And in this case, the Republicans are getting the blame. Not particularly deserved, but there you go. At about the same time, and probably not entirely unrelated, because remember, this is a time of a lot of economic stress. You have the Colfax Massacre. This happens in Louisiana. There was an election. There was dispute about just exactly who had won, and it leads to armed conflict between Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats think that they should have won the election, and so a lot of guys with guns, make their way into town and start shooting anybody that looks like a Republican. And the easiest way to identify is if they are African American. Things didn't go very well for the African Americans. They surrendered, laid down their weapons, and were just slaughtered, which is why we call it the Colfax Massacre. Now, this was the worst example of the kind of racial violence that was going on in 1873, but it's not the only example. There was a lot of this going on in a lot of different places, organized by these informal, shadowy groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, other groups that were operating outside of any kind of official sanction. They certainly, politicians, white elite politicians knew what was going on. They approved of what was going on, but technically this was not state government action. And that's important when the case gets to the Supreme Court. The people who perpetrated the Colfax massacre get arrested by the federal authorities, and they get charged with violations of the Civil Rights Act. And the case makes its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in the decision in U.S. versus Cruikshank, Chief Justice Waite rules that the 14th Amendment only applies to government. So the federal government can enforce states, providing civil rights, but that is not a power that extends to private people. If somebody who is not a part of the state government interferes with civil rights, that's a criminal matter for the state to prosecute or not prosecute, according to what the state decides to do. And this is really kind of cutting the stuffing out of the 14th Amendment. Now, why is Chief Justice Waite doing this? Chief Justice Waite is not a Southerner. He's from Ohio. He was one of the founders of the Republican Party. But his concern as a Republican moderate is he doesn't want to see federal power get too great. He wants to maintain the traditional idea that criminal law is a matter for the states and not a matter for the central government. And I think he understood that this was going to create problems in the South, but overturning the constitutional order is not something that he's willing to do just to protect the rights of the freedmen. The other case that Chief Justice Waite is going to chime in on is going to similarly diminish the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment said you couldn't restrict of race or previous condition of servitude. But it didn't say you couldn't restrict voting for other reasons. And the Supreme Court ruled in U.S. v. Reese that states can restrict voting for all kinds of reasons as long as those reasons are not explicitly based on race. And so you have things like poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses, and I'm assuming you learned about all those things in government class, so I won't go into a huge amount of detail. But between these two Supreme Court decisions, a lot of the federal ability to kind of reach down into the states and protect the freedmen is going out the window. And that, probably more than anything else, is going to bring about the end of Reconstruction. As the Reconstruction governments lose power, the white elites come back into the majority using a combination of violence and social pressure, pretty much doing everything they can to sort of peel off the freedmen and, make everything about race. Because if everything is about race, all the white people of the South will hang together, and the traditional elites will be in charge. So they're making it very difficult for people to reach across and coalitions that was really going to be necessary for Reconstruction to be permanent. And one of the tools for that was this idea that poor whites could be labeled as mixed race. Remember, before the Civil War, there really wasn't a registry of what race people just knew. Everybody lived in a small town, and everybody knew who your parents were, and so you were labeled based on that. But as people start to become more urbanized, they move into cities and that kind of thing, you start to have birth certificates and registration and records, and as those things are created, the people who are in charge of that process are saying, well, we don't know a whole lot about your ancestry, Mr. Poor White Man, because your parents were, kind of in the informal economy, living on the edge of society, and we think that probably you're black. Unless, of course, you want to get on board with the whole white solidarity thing, in which case, and that is a powerful weapon to peel more and more whites off of the little guy coalition. And so you're going to have, by the time you get to the late part of the 19th century, you're going to have very few white people in the South who are willing to have anything bad to say about the Confederacy or anything good to say about Reconstruction. Um, and that is going to create this thing called the Solid South, where Republicans are not going to get any votes to speak of when elections are held in the South from the last half of the 19th century all the way into I think you're into the 1970s before Southern states really have anything like a two-party system. So that's the situation as we go into the election of 1876. So the Republicans are still reeling from the financial panic and all the allegations of corruption. And the Democrats are going to nominate another New York governor, Samuel Tilden, who's going to get 184 electoral votes. Rutherford B. Hayes, governor of Ohio, is going to get 165 electoral votes. But there are 20 electoral votes in dispute. And this is something that sounds familiar from our vantage point in 2020. You had Republican electors in all of these places who had certificates of election signed by the governor, and that had been the normal practice of doing things. But you also had Democratic electors who had election certificates signed by, maybe a Democratic official, a Secretary of State or a judge or, somebody else. And they're contending that they are, in fact, the legitimate electoral votes. Well, when that sort of thing happens, it goes to Congress. And much as in the case right now, Republican Senate, Democratic House, so Congress deadlocks on this issue of which votes get counted. What they do to sort of resolve the constitutional crisis is they form an electoral commission. The electoral commission has equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats, and one Supreme Court justice who's supposed to make everything nice and fair. At the end of the day, they pretty much follow the traditional rules and go with the governor's signature, and Hayes is going to win by one electoral vote. A lot of Democrats are going to be upset about this, but this is the way it's going to go. Now, Hayes is then going to remove the Army from the South. And there's this thing that sometimes people talk about, the Compromise of 1877. And the argument is, that the Southerners supported Hayes as president in return for him removing the Army from the South and ending Reconstruction. And that was kind of the tale for a very long time. But modern historians, when they look back at that, say, yeah, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Wouldn't they have been, Tilden would have also removed the Army from the South. In fact, after the Supreme Court decisions, the Army wasn't really able to do a whole lot in the South. So Reconstruction was already ending at this point. The real, I think, interesting thing is this sort of unspoken understanding between conservative Democrats and moderate to conservative Republicans, who are all interested in sort of social and economic stability and maintaining the sanctity of debt and that kind of stuff. And that is the true coalition, where even though Democrats are or Southerners are going to generally support the Democratic Party, one of the things they are going to do is keep the Democratic Party from becoming too radical. And so this is going to be a force that, the powers that be find useful. And so, we're going to get a situation where Northerners are mostly going to not make a fuss about civil rights, and Southerners are going to institutionalize segregation through Jim Crow laws, which are basically explicit laws that segregate all social interaction between the races. And the upshot of that is going to be pretty much not a whole lot of opportunity for African Americans. So this is kind of where we're at. And this is where we're going to be for the next, 100 years. Civil rights isn't going to become a major national issue again until the 1950s, for a lot of reasons that we're not going to go into right now. But so if you want to call this the end of Reconstruction, the failure of Reconstruction, that's certainly a common interpretation. Although it is important to realize that what we're looking at here is not the same thing we were looking at in the 1850s. A lot of change has happened, not enough change, but certainly a lot of change. And so it's a complicated question of whether Reconstruction was successful, how successful it was. It's a question that historians are still struggling with. But this is as far as we're going to go today. So thank you for listening.